The silence in Admiral Caelthorne Vex's command chamber was absolute, the kind of quiet that preceded either triumph or annihilation. 3 fleets, 3 entire battle groups had vanished into what the star charts claimed was empty space, leaving behind nothing but ghost signals and the acrid taste of fear in every command center across the hegemony. Vex stared at the holographic display floating before his scaled hands, watching red markers blink where the 7th Expeditionary Force had simply ceased to exist. No distress calls, no debris fields, no survivors, just a coordinates point in Sector 7743 null that made veteran navigators refuse direct orders and request transfers to the Outer Rim conflicts instead. "Admiral," came the voice of his aide, Keth Morwin, whose usually steady tone carried an undertone that made Vex's combat-hardened instincts prickle with warning. "Intelligence Command is requesting your immediate presence. Classification level: Obsidian Black. Obsidian Black." Vex had held supreme command for 43 standard cycles, had witnessed the subjugation of 17 planetary systems, had watched civilizations burn at his word, but he had never seen an Obsidian Black classification. That was the stuff of legends whispered in the deep void stations, where old admirals gathered to drink fermented kelp wine and trade stories they claimed were fiction. The intelligence facility on Station Zerion 7 existed in a state of perpetual twilight, its corridors lined with quantum-shielded walls that hummed with suppressed energy. Vex's footsteps echoed against metal floors that had been polished to mirror perfection, reflecting distorted images of his towering frame as he moved through security checkpoints manned by guards whose species he didn't recognize, a troubling detail in itself. Director Halveth Krisk waited in a chamber so deep within the station's core that Vex could feel the artificial gravity fluctuating around the edges. The director was Vorthak, a species known for their methodical approach to information gathering and their complete inability to lie, which made their next words all the more disturbing. "The missing fleets are not missing, Admiral. They are dead, all of them. Destroyed by an enemy that, according to our official records, has been extinct for over 2 centuries. Vex settled into the chair designed for his physiology, feeling the bio-adaptive cushioning adjust to his weight. "Extinct enemies don't typically engage in fleet-scale warfare, Director. Perhaps you could elaborate before my patience encounters its own extinction event." "Humans, Admiral. The species from Sol 3. The ones we supposedly wiped out during the Great Cleansing of 2387. The name hit Vex like a plasma bolt to the thorax. Humans. Even admirals who had never fought in the Terran campaign knew the stories. Savage bipeds who fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness, who refused to surrender even when facing impossible odds, who turned every defeat into a Pyrrhic victory that cost their enemies more than conquest was worth. "The humans are extinct," Vex said, though his voice carried less conviction than he would have liked. "I've read the reports. Their homeworld was glassed from orbit. The survivors scattered to primitive colonies were hunted down and eliminated. This is established historical fact." Director Krisk activated a holographic display that filled the chamber with swirling data streams and star charts. "That is what the public records state, yes. But Admiral, when was the last time you personally verified those records? When did you last cross-reference the original military reports with the sanitized versions in our databases?" Vex studied the director's expression, noting the subtle tension around the edges of their compound eyes. "Are you suggesting that the official historical accounts of the human extinction are inaccurate?" "I am suggesting, Admiral, that someone has been very carefully editing our records. Observe. Dai." The holographic display shifted, revealing a star chart of the local galactic arm. Vex recognized the major systems, the trade routes, the strategic choke points that had shaped military doctrine for the past 3 centuries. But as he watched, certain areas of the chart began to blur. Coordinates that should have led to specific systems instead showed empty space. Star classifications that should have indicated resource-rich worlds displayed as navigational hazard, avoid. Sector 7743 null, Chris continued, highlighting a region that seemed to bend light around its edges. Officially contains nothing of strategic value. No habitable worlds, no asteroid mining opportunities, no spatial anomalies worth investigating. It is, according to our navigational computers, a dead zone that most admirals simply route around without conscious thought. Most admirals, Vex repeated slowly. But not all. No, Admiral, not all. 3 battle groups in the past 6 months have received orders that came from the highest levels of command, to conduct routine patrol sweeps through that sector. None returned. And here is where our investigation becomes problematic. The director manipulated the holographic controls, and suddenly the chamber filled with voice recordings, fragments of communications that seemed to have been pulled from the quantum foam itself. Unknown vessels detected at bearing 7 Mark IV. Defensive formations. They're using some kind of stealth technology. We've never... Impossible. Our sensors show empty space, but the impacts are real. Repeat, we are taking fire from empty space. The recordings cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence that seemed to press against Vex's consciousness like a living thing. He had heard thousands of battle recordings during his career, had listened to the final moments of ships and crews under his command, but there was something about these fragments that made his combat instincts scream warnings. Analysis suggests, Chris continued, their voice dropping to barely above a whisper, that these battle groups encountered defensive technology significantly more advanced than anything in our current tactical databases. Energy signatures that don't match any known species, combat patterns that seem to anticipate our standard military doctrine with disturbing accuracy. Vex stood and began pacing, a habit he had developed during the siege of Krelion Prime, when tactical decisions meant the difference between victory and the annihilation of his fleet. You're telling me that an extinct species has somehow developed superior military technology and is using it to eliminate our battle groups in a region of space that doesn't officially exist? That is exactly what I am telling you, Admiral, and there's more. More. Vex felt a cold sensation spreading through his primary circulatory system, the kind of chill that came from staring into tactical situations with no viable solutions. The director activated another series of displays, this time showing intelligence reports from across the hegemony. In the past 18 months, we have documented 17 separate incidents of equipment malfunction in our most secure facilities. Research stations experiencing mysterious data corruption, military contractors reporting the theft of classified schematics, deep space monitoring posts going offline for brief periods during which their sensor logs show irregularities. What kind of irregularities? The kind that suggests someone has been systematically gathering intelligence about our military capabilities, our defensive strategies, our command structures. Someone who understands our technology well enough to bypass our security systems without leaving obvious traces. Vex studied the pattern of incidents on the galactic map, noting how they formed a rough circle around the coordinates where the battle groups had vanished. Intelligence gathering for what purpose? Unknown, but Admiral Krisk paused, manipulating the controls to bring up a final display. 3 days ago, our deep space monitoring network detected a transmission from Sector 7743 null, a transmission using outdated hegemony military encryption protocols. The chamber fell silent, except for the subtle hum of the station's life support systems. Vex felt his tactical mind racing through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Outdated protocols. How outdated? 237 years, Admiral. The same encryption methods we used during the final phases of the human extermination campaign. Vex stared at the display, watching the signal pattern repeat. in an endless loop. The implications were cascading through his consciousness like a tactical nightmare coming into focus. If humans had survived, if they had been hiding in a sector of space that had been deliberately erased from galactic records, then everything the hegemony believed about its own history was a carefully constructed lie. "Director," he said finally, his voice carrying the tone of absolute command that had served him through decades of warfare. "I want access to the original military reports from the human campaign, not the sanitized versions in our current databases, the raw intelligence files that were filed immediately after the supposed extinction event. Those files, Admiral, are classified at levels beyond even my clearance. They are stored in the vault of censored knowledge on the Galactic Council core, behind security systems that haven't been penetrated since their installation." "Then I suppose," Vex said, already calculating the logistics of what he was about to propose, "it's time someone penetrated them." The vault of censored knowledge existed in a dimension slightly offset from normal space-time, accessible only through quantum tunnels that required clearance codes changed daily by the Council's most trusted security algorithms. Vex had never seen the vault, but like every senior officer in the hegemony, he had heard descriptions that bordered on the mythological. Director Krisk had provided him with entry codes that technically didn't exist, a favor that would cost them both their careers if discovered, and quite possibly their lives. The quantum tunnel journey took 17 standard hours, during which Vex found himself alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that the universe he had served faithfully for 4 decades was built on foundations more fragile than anyone suspected. The vault itself defied architectural logic, its corridors extending in directions that shouldn't have been possible within the confines of the structure's exterior dimensions. Information storage units lined the walls like crystalline monuments to secrets too dangerous for public consumption, each one containing knowledge that had been deemed too destabilizing for galactic civilization. Vex moved through the maze-like passages, following coordinates that Krisk had somehow acquired through channels that the director had declined to explain. The silence here was different from the command chambers and tactical centers where he spent most of his time. This was the silence of buried truths and suppressed histories. The storage unit containing the human campaign files occupied an entire chamber, its crystalline structure pulsing with energy patterns that suggested information density beyond standard military records. Vex approached the access terminal, inputting the codes that would either grant him access to the truth or trigger security protocols that would end his investigation permanently. The holographic interface materialized around him, displaying a directory structure that made his combat-hardened mind struggle to comprehend the scope of what he was seeing. Thousands of files, thousands of individual reports, tactical assessments, intelligence summaries, and post-action analyses related to what the official histories described as a straightforward extermination campaign against a primitive species. He began with the earliest files, reading reports from the initial contact phase when hegemony exploration fleets first encountered human civilization. The early assessments were dismissive. Bipedal primates with crude chemical rockets and nuclear weapons, confined to a single star system with no apparent capability for faster-than-light travel. But as he progressed through the chronological sequence, the tone of the reports began to change. References to unexpected tactical adaptations and anomalous defensive strategies began appearing with increasing frequency. Intelligence officers noted that human responses to hegemony probing attacks seemed to anticipate standard military doctrine with disturbing accuracy. Then came the battle reports from the first attempted invasion of the Sol system, and Vex felt his understanding of military history beginning to crumble. Human vessels displaying impossible maneuverability patterns. Energy signatures don't match any known propulsion technology. Defensive formations suggest prior knowledge of hegemony fleet tactics. The reports painted a picture of a species that shouldn't have been able to mount effective resistance against the hegemony's overwhelming technological superiority, yet somehow managed to inflict casualties that forced the invasion fleet to withdraw and regroup. Worse, the reports suggested that human defensive capabilities were improving at a rate that defied all theoretical models of technological development. Admiral Corinth Valdris, the officer who had commanded the initial invasion attempt, had filed a final report that made Vex's blood run cold with its implications. Recommend immediate escalation to planetary bombardment protocols. Human military capabilities are advancing at an exponential rate that suggests external technological assistance or access to information sources beyond our current understanding. Standard invasion procedures are proving ineffective against defensive strategies that seem designed specifically to counter our tactical doctrine. Further delay risks allowing human forces to achieve technological parity or superiority. The bombardment had begun 3 months later, turning Earth's surface into a molten wasteland that glowed visibly from orbit. The official record stated that no human settlements survived the initial attack and that subsequent mop-up operations had eliminated the scattered refugee populations on outlying colonies within the Sol system. But buried deep within the classified files, Vex found intelligence reports that told a different story. Sensor readings showing massive underground installations that had somehow survived the bombardment. Detection of evacuation fleets launching from hidden bases in the asteroid belt during the early phases of the attack. References to deep space installations of unknown purpose that had been dismissed as sensor ghosts or navigational errors. Most disturbing of all were the final reports filed by cleanup operations in the months following the bombardment. Multiple references to equipment malfunctions and navigational anomalies that had prevented thorough surveying of the outer system. Entire scouting missions that had simply vanished while investigating asteroid installations or deep space facilities. The last file in the sequence was a memorandum from the Galactic Council's Intelligence Directorate, dated exactly 200 years ago. Classification level raised to obsidian black. All records related to human military capabilities to be transferred to restricted archives. Public records to reflect complete species extinction. Sector 7743 redesignated as Navigational Hazard Zone. Civilian and military traffic to be discouraged through standard administrative protocols. No further investigation of Sol system authorized without direct council approval. Vex stared at the memorandum, feeling pieces of a massive puzzle beginning to fall into place. The humans hadn't been exterminated. They had been buried, erased from official history, not because they were dead, but because someone at the highest levels of galactic government had decided that their continued existence was too dangerous to acknowledge. He scrolled through additional files, finding references to monitoring protocols and containment procedures that extended decades beyond the supposed extinction date. Intelligence reports describing anomalous activities in sectors adjacent to the former Sol system. Scattered references to human infiltration operatives and deep cover assets that had been dismissed as paranoid speculation by intelligence analysts who had no access to the full picture. But there was one file that made everything else pale by comparison, a single intelligence assessment filed by a deep cover operative whose name had been redacted from the records. The report was dated just 5 years ago, and its contents were so disturbing that Vex had to read them twice before their implications fully registered. Human civilization has not only survived, but has been actively expanding its influence throughout the galactic community. Evidence suggests a coordinated intelligence operation spanning multiple centuries, with deep cover operatives embedded within major governmental, military and commercial organizations across all major species. Recommend immediate council-level briefing and consideration of alternative approaches to the human situation. The file ended there with no indication of what those alternative approaches might have involved. But attached to the intelligence assessment was a single additional document, a list of names and positions throughout the hegemony's command structure, marked with a simple notation: suspected human assets. Verification incomplete. Vex scrolled through the list, feeling a cold dread settling in his primary stomach as he recognized name after name. Fleet commanders he had served alongside, intelligence directors he had briefed on tactical situations. Even members of the hegemony's ruling council appeared on the list, their loyalty to their own species suddenly cast into question. And there, near the bottom of the list, was a name that made his breathing passages constrict with shock: Director Halveth Krisk. The journey back to Station Xerion 7 passed in a haze of strategic calculations and worst-case scenario planning. Vex found himself analyzing every conversation he had ever had with Krisk, every briefing and intelligence assessment, looking for signs of deception or manipulation that he had missed. The director's inability to lie, a fundamental characteristic of the Vorthak species, suddenly seemed less like a biological limitation and more like a carefully crafted performance. By the time Vex reached his personal quarters, he had constructed a mental framework for understanding the scope of what humanity had achieved. Not extinction, but evolution. Not defeat, but strategic withdrawal. They had allowed the hegemony to believe in their own victory while systematically infiltrating the very civilization that had tried to destroy them. He sealed his quarters and activated the highest level of privacy shielding available, then began composing an encrypted message to the one person in the hegemony he still trusted completely: Admiral Thekla Horun, his former tactical advisor, who now commanded the 5th Deep Strike Force on the Outer Rim. If anyone could help him navigate the implications of what he had discovered, it would be Horun. But before he could complete the message, his personal communications array chimed with an incoming priority transmission. The sender identification made his combat instincts flare to full alert. Director Halveth Krisk. "Admiral," came the director's voice through the encrypted channel. "I trust your research expedition to the vault proved educational?" Vex felt his hand moving instinctively toward the plasma sidearm he wore even in his private quarters. "Director, yes, quite educational. I learned some fascinating details about historical record-keeping and the creative potential of intelligence classification systems." "I'm certain you did. Perhaps we should meet to discuss your findings. There are aspects of the current situation that may benefit from collaborative analysis." The phrasing was typical Krisk, methodical and precise, but there was something underneath it that Vex's tactical instincts recognized as danger. "Of course, Director. Shall we meet in your office, or would you prefer neutral ground?" "Actually, Admiral, I was hoping you might join me on a brief excursion. There's someone who very much wants to meet you, someone who has been following your career with considerable interest." Vex felt the universe shifting around him, tactical possibilities cascading through his mind like a strategic simulation running at maximum speed. "Someone, Director? Anyone I know?" "Oh, I think you'll find them quite familiar, Admiral. After all..." There was a pause, and when Krisk's voice continued, it carried an undertone that made Vex's primary circulatory system flood with combat stimulants. "They've been expecting you for quite some time." The transmission ended, leaving Vex alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that his investigation had crossed a line from which there would be no return. He completed his message to Admiral Horun, encoding it with personal ciphers that only she would recognize, then activated his personal security protocols and began preparing for whatever confrontation was approaching. Outside his quarters, Station Xerion 7 continued its routine operations, but Vex could no longer view anything as routine. Every crew member he encountered might be exactly who they appeared to be, or they might be something else entirely. Every routine communication might contain hidden meanings or encrypted instructions, that he lacked the context to understand. The universe had become a place where extinct species could operate invisible fleets, and where trusted allies might serve masters whose very existence was officially denied. And somewhere in the depths of space that didn't officially exist, something was waiting for him, with a patience that spanned centuries. 3 hours later, Director Krisk arrived at Vex's quarters with an escort that made the Admiral's tactical mind shift immediately into threat assessment mode. The guards were clearly military. Their bearing and the way they moved through the station's corridors spoke of extensive combat training, but their equipment was unlike anything in the hegemony's standard inventory. Their armor seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the weapons they carried hummed with energy signatures that Vex's instruments couldn't identify. "Admiral," Krisk said as the door sealed behind them, "allow me to introduce Captain Daleth Morrison, Security Chief for this operation." Vex studied the figure who stepped forward, noting immediately that this was unlike any Vorthak he had ever encountered. The basic physiology was correct, but there were subtle differences in proportion and movement that suggested either genetic modification or something else entirely. "Admiral Vex," Morrison said, and even the voice patterns were somehow wrong, carrying inflections that didn't match standard Vorthak speech patterns. "I've been looking forward to this meeting for some time. Your tactical reputation precedes you." "Captain Morrison," Vex replied, keeping his voice carefully neutral while his mind raced through possibilities. "I don't believe we've been introduced through standard military channels." Morrison's expression shifted in a way that would have been subtle to most observers, but Vex's decades of reading alien physiological cues caught the micro-expressions that suggested amusement. "No, Admiral. Standard channels would be inappropriate for our current circumstances." Director Krisk moved to the chamber's central holographic display, activating controls that brought up a star chart Vex didn't recognize. "Admiral, what we're about to show you is classified at levels that exceed even obsidian black. The information you accessed in the vault was merely the beginning of a much larger truth." The star chart shifted, revealing spatial territories that extended far beyond the hegemony's mapped regions. But it wasn't the scope of the unknown space that made Vex's combat instincts spike to maximum alert. It was the tactical markings overlaying the display: fleet positions, supply routes, strategic choke points. Someone had been conducting detailed military reconnaissance across entire galactic quadrants. "Human reconnaissance," Morrison said, apparently reading Vex's expression with uncomfortable accuracy. 2 centuries of careful observation and strategic positioning. Did you really think a species capable of forcing your initial invasion fleet to withdraw would simply accept extinction quietly? Vex felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a picture that challenged everything he thought he understood about galactic politics and military balance. The reports from the vault suggested infiltration operations, but this, he gestured at the holographic display, this represents military preparation on a scale that would require resources equivalent to a major galactic power. "Resources," Krisk said, "that humanity has been acquiring through careful manipulation of galactic commerce and strategic positioning over the course of 2 centuries. While the hegemony and other major powers have been focused on territorial expansion and resource competition, humans have been building something else entirely." Morrison manipulated the display controls, and the star chart shifted to show energy signatures and fleet movements that made Vex's tactical mind struggle to process the implications. Massive formations of vessels moving through space using stealth technology that rendered them virtually undetectable. Supply networks that extended across multiple sectors. Communication arrays that could coordinate operations across galactic distances without utilizing standard, faster-than-light transmission methods. "Admiral," Morrison continued, "what you're seeing represents the most sophisticated military operation in galactic history, A species that was supposedly exterminated has spent 2 centuries building the infrastructure necessary to challenge every major power in the galaxy simultaneously. Challenge them how? Vex asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Morrison's expression shifted again, and this time Vex caught something that made his circulatory system flood with alarm. The micro-expressions weren't quite right for a Vorthak, but they were perfect for another species entirely, species whose physiological cues he had studied extensively during the human campaign research. By demonstrating that everything you believe about military superiority and technological advantage is an illusion carefully maintained by beings who understand your tactical doctrine better than you understand it yourselves. The holographic display shifted again, this time showing detailed schematics of hegemony military vessels. Not general specifications that might be available through intelligence gathering, but precise technical blueprints that included classified modifications and recent upgrades. Information that should have been impossible for any external organization to acquire. How? Vex asked, though his tactical mind was already providing answers he didn't want to acknowledge. Because, Admiral, Morrison said, and when he continued his voice carried an accent that definitely wasn't Vorthak, we helped design them. The transformation happened so gradually that Vex almost missed it. Morrison's posture shifted subtly, his breathing patterns changed, and the micro-expressions that had seemed wrong for a Vorthak suddenly resolved into patterns that Vex recognized from his study of human physiological cues. The face remained the same, but everything else, voice, mannerisms, even the way he held his shoulders, became unmistakably human. Holographic projection, Morrison explained, gesturing to what Vex now realized was a sophisticated disguise system. Useful for long-term, deep-cover operations. I've been Captain Daleth Morrison for the past 15 years, serving in various intelligence positions throughout the hegemony's military structure. Vex's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Morrison raised a hand in a gesture that somehow managed to be both peaceful and threatening. Admiral, if we intended to harm you, this conversation would have ended before it began. We're here because you've demonstrated the tactical intelligence necessary to understand what's really happening in this galaxy. Director Krisk, who still appeared to be genuinely Vorthak, manipulated the holographic controls again, bringing up displays that showed the locations where the 3 missing battle groups had vanished. The fleets weren't destroyed, Admiral. They were recruited. Shown the truth about galactic politics and given a choice, Morrison continued. Continue serving a civilization that has built its expansion on the systematic extermination of species deemed inconvenient, or join an organization dedicated to preventing such genocides in the future. The holographic display shifted to show interior views of what appeared to be massive space stations, their corridors filled with beings from dozens of different species. Vex recognized hegemony uniforms mixed with equipment from the Krellian Confederacy, the Zephyr Collective, and at least 6 other major galactic powers. This is impossible, Vex said, though his tactical mind was already analyzing the implications. The coordination required for this level of infiltration would take centuries, Morrison agreed, which is exactly how long we've been working on it. The human approach to warfare isn't about overwhelming force or technological superiority, Admiral. It's about understanding your enemy better than they understand themselves, then using that knowledge to turn their own strengths against them. Director Krisk activated another series of displays, these showing communication intercepts and intelligence reports that painted a picture of systemic manipulation spanning decades. Every major conflict in the past 50 years has been influenced by human intelligence operations. The Theron Rebellion, the Crystalline War, the recent tensions between the hegemony and the outer colonies, all carefully orchestrated to weaken the major powers while positioning human assets in key strategic locations. Vex studied the information streams, his decades of military experience allowing him to see patterns that would have been invisible to civilian observers. "You've been using our conflicts against each other to position yourselves for what exactly?" Morrison's expression became serious, and Vex caught undertones that suggested this conversation was approaching its crucial point. "For the day when we reveal ourselves publicly and offer the galaxy an alternative to the current system, a choice between continued cycles of conquest and extermination, or cooperation under a framework that protects all species from the kind of fate that befell Earth. And if the major powers refuse, then they'll discover that their military capabilities have been compromised in ways they never suspected." Morrison gestured to the holographic displays. "Every major fleet in the galaxy contains vessels whose systems have been modified, communication arrays that can be accessed remotely, navigation computers that can be redirected, weapons systems that can be disabled or turned against their own forces." The implications cascaded through Vex's tactical mind like a strategic nightmare. If humanity had indeed spent 2 centuries infiltrating the infrastructure of galactic civilization, then every military advantage the major powers believed they possessed was an illusion. Their fleets could be turned into weapons against themselves. Their communication networks could be co-opted for human purposes. Their very ability to coordinate large-scale military operations could be neutralized with a few strategic commands. "This is beyond infiltration," Vex said slowly. "This is total strategic dominance, achieved through methods that no military academy even teaches. Because military academies focus on defeating enemies who fight according to predictable patterns," Morrison replied. "Humans learned long ago that the key to survival isn't building better weapons. It's understanding how to make your enemy's weapons irrelevant." Director Krisk manipulated the display controls one final time, bringing up a real-time tactical overview of the hegemony's current fleet positions. Red markers indicated vessels whose systems had been compromised. Vex felt his primary circulatory system nearly stop functioning as he realized that over 60% of the hegemony's military forces were marked in red. "Admiral," Morrison said softly, "the war for galactic civilization ended 2 centuries ago. The major powers just haven't realized they lost yet." The silence that followed was filled with the subtle humming of the station's life support systems and the distant vibrations of ships docking at external ports. Vex found himself staring at the holographic display, his tactical mind running through scenarios and possibilities, searching for viable strategic responses to a situation that defied every principle of military doctrine he had learned during 4 decades of warfare. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. Morrison exchanged a look with Director Krisk that seemed to carry volumes of unspoken communication. "Admiral, your reputation as a tactical innovator precedes you. Your analysis of the Krellian siege showed strategic thinking that impressed even our military advisors. We're offering you the opportunity to be part of something larger than the endless cycle of conquest and territorial expansion that has defined galactic civilization for the past millennium." "Part of what exactly?" "The transition to what comes next. The revelation of humanity's survival and the introduction of new frameworks for interspecies cooperation. It will require careful management to prevent panic and maintain stability, but the alternative—" Morrison gestured to the tactical display, where the compromised fleet positions glowed red like an infection spreading through the hegemony's military infrastructure. "The alternative is watching galactic civilization tear itself apart when the truth becomes impossible to conceal any longer." Vex studied the faces, one genuinely alien, one concealed behind sophisticated holographic projection, and realized that he was standing at a pivotal point, not just in his own career, but in the history of galactic civilization itself. Every decision he made in the next few minutes would ripple outward through consequences he couldn't fully predict. And if I refuse, if I choose to report what I've learned through standard military channels? Morrison's expression remained carefully neutral, but Vex caught micro-expressions that suggested the human was evaluating multiple contingency plans simultaneously. Admiral, you're a tactician. You understand the concept of strategic inevitability. The truth about humanity's survival will become public knowledge within the next few years, regardless of your decision. Our infiltration of major governmental and military organizations has reached a saturation point where concealment is no longer sustainable. The only question, Director Krisk added, is whether the revelation happens in a controlled manner that minimizes civilian casualties and maintains political stability, or whether it happens chaotically through events that no one can predict or control. Vex felt the weight of centuries of galactic history pressing down on his consciousness. Every war he had fought, every tactical decision he had made, every strategic assumption that had guided his career, all of it suddenly seemed like part of a larger pattern that he was only beginning to understand. You're asking me to betray everything I've sworn to protect. No, Admiral, Morrison said quietly. We're asking you to help protect it from the consequences of discovering too late that the foundation it's built on has been undermined for 2 centuries. The holographic display shifted one final time, showing population centers across hegemony space, billions of beings whose lives would be affected by whatever decision Vex made in this chamber. Civilian populations who had no involvement in the military and political machinations that had shaped their civilization, but who would bear the consequences of systemic collapse if the transition wasn't managed carefully. How long do I have to decide? Morrison checked a chronometer whose design Vex didn't recognize. Events are already in motion, Admiral. 3 days from now, the Galactic Council will receive a formal communication from the Human Colonial Authority, an organization that, according to official records, shouldn't exist. The message will detail humanity's survival and present a proposal for establishing new frameworks for interspecies cooperation. 3 days, Vex repeated, his tactical mind already calculating the implications. And if the Council rejects the proposal, then they'll discover that their rejection doesn't actually matter, Director Krisk said, because the infrastructure for implementing those frameworks has already been put in place over the course of 2 centuries. The choice isn't whether change will happen. It's whether the current leadership will participate in managing that change or be replaced by individuals who will. Vex stared at the tactical display, watching the red markers that indicated compromised systems pulse like heartbeats across the hegemony's military infrastructure. The scope of what humanity had achieved was beyond anything in recorded military history. A strategic operation so vast and sophisticated that it redefined what was possible in terms of long-term military planning. I need time to think. Of course, Admiral. But remember, Morrison's voice carried undertones that reminded Vex uncomfortably of the combat recordings he had heard from the vanished battle groups. While you're thinking, the universe is changing around you. The question isn't whether you can stop what's coming, it's whether you want to help shape what replaces the current system. Director Krisk deactivated the holographic displays, returning the chamber to normal lighting. Admiral, Captain Morrison will remain available if you have questions. I suggest you use the time to consider not just the tactical implications, but the strategic inevitability of what you've learned. Udis. As the 2 figures prepared to leave, Vex found himself asking the question that had been building in his mind since the conversation began. Why me? Why approach me specifically with this information? Morrison paused at the chamber entrance, his projected Vorthak features shifting subtly as he considered his response. Because, Admiral, your tactical innovations during the Krellian siege showed us that you understand something most military commanders miss, that the most effective victories are the ones where your enemy doesn't realize they've been defeated until the battle is already over. The silence that followed their departure was different from the tactical quiet Vex was accustomed to during strategic planning sessions. This was the silence of a universe that had fundamentally changed while he wasn't looking, leaving him alone with decisions that would affect the lives of billions of beings across dozens of star systems. Vex moved to his personal communications array and began composing another encrypted message to Admiral Horan, but found himself staring at the blank interface without knowing what to say. How do you explain to your most trusted colleague that everything both of you have dedicated your careers to serving might be an elaborate illusion maintained by the very enemies you thought you had defeated centuries ago? Instead, he sealed his quarters and began reviewing his personal files, tactical assessments, strategic analyses, military doctrine studies, looking for patterns he might have missed. Signs that the battles he had fought and the victories he had achieved were part of a larger strategic framework designed by minds that thought in terms of centuries rather than standard military cycles. The deeper he dug into his own records, the more disturbing the implications became. The Krelion siege that had made his reputation, he had attributed his innovative tactics to intuitive strategic thinking, but now he wondered if someone had been subtly guiding his decision-making process. Intelligence reports that had arrived at precisely the right moments to influence his tactical choices. Equipment failures in enemy forces that had seemed like fortunate coincidences. Supply lines that had remained intact despite being obvious targets for disruption. Vex activated his personal analysis suite and began running pattern recognition algorithms on his mission history, searching for statistical anomalies that might indicate external manipulation. What he found made his combat instincts surge to maximum alert. The probability curves for his tactical successes were so far outside normal parameters that they could only be explained by either impossible luck or careful orchestration by someone with intimate knowledge of enemy capabilities and intentions. His communications array chimed with an incoming message from Admiral Horan, responding to his earlier transmission. The encryption patterns looked correct, but as Vex began reading, he found himself analyzing every word for hidden meanings or subtle indications that his most trusted colleague might not be who she appeared to be. Kelthorn, your message concerns me. The information you've uncovered sounds like the kind of intelligence operation that would require resources and coordination beyond anything in our current threat assessments. I'm attaching some data that might be relevant. We've been tracking unusual activities in our sector that could be connected to your discoveries. Be careful who you trust with this information. Some truths are too dangerous for standard military channels. Attached to the message were tactical reports from the Outer Rim, describing encounters with vessels whose technology signatures didn't match any known species. Ships that appeared on sensors for brief moments before vanishing completely, leaving behind energy readings that suggested stealth capabilities far beyond current theoretical limits. Personnel transfers and equipment requisitions that followed patterns suggesting someone was systematically positioning assets throughout the fleet command structure. But what made Vex's primary circulatory system nearly stop functioning was the final attachment, a personnel file showing the service record of Admiral Tekla Horan herself. According to the official records, she had begun her military career as a junior intelligence officer specializing in xenocultural analysis, with particular expertise in human behavioral patterns and tactical psychology. Human behavioral patterns. Expertise that would have been considered irrelevant academic curiosity in a galaxy where humans were supposedly extinct, unless someone had reasons to believe that such knowledge might prove useful. Vex stared at the file, running through memories of conversations and strategic consultations that stretched back decades. Horan's uncanny ability to predict enemy tactical decisions. Her innovative approaches to psychological warfare that seemed to understand alien psychology better than the species understood themselves. her tendency to recommend strategic approaches that achieved objectives with minimal casualties, a philosophy that aligned suspiciously well with the humanitarian concerns that human civilization had been known for before the bombardment. His tactical mind began constructing scenarios, each more disturbing than the last. If Horan was a human operative who had been positioned to influence his career development, then his reputation as a tactical innovator might be based on insights provided by someone with access to intelligence sources he couldn't imagine. His victories might have been achieved through the systematic manipulation of enemy forces by human operatives embedded throughout the galactic military infrastructure. But if that was true, it raised questions that challenged his understanding of his own identity and purpose. Had his entire career been orchestrated as part of some larger human strategic objective? Were his tactical insights actually his own, or was he simply an instrument being played by minds that operated according to principles he was only beginning to understand? The communications array chimed again, this time with a message from Director Krisk. The transmission was brief, but laden with implications that made Vex's combat instinct spike to full alert. Admiral, events are accelerating beyond our projected timeline. Recommend immediate decision regarding your participation in upcoming operations. Window for controlled transition may be shorter than originally estimated. Vex found himself in the middle of a strategic situation unlike anything in his military experience. Traditional tactical doctrine provided no guidance for scenarios where the fundamental assumptions about enemy capabilities and intentions were revealed to be completely inaccurate. How do you plan defensive strategies against opponents who have been infiltrating your own command structure for centuries? How do you evaluate intelligence reports when the sources of that intelligence might be the very enemies you're trying to defend against? He began drafting a response to Horan's message, but found himself analyzing every word for multiple layers of meaning. If she was genuinely the colleague he had trusted for decades, then his message might provide crucial intelligence for defending against a human operation of unprecedented scope. But if she was a human operative, then anything he communicated could be used to accelerate whatever plans were already in motion. In the end, he composed a deliberately ambiguous response that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on the reader's actual loyalties. Thekla, your analysis confirms my suspicions about the scope of what we're facing. I'm beginning to understand that our tactical assumptions may need fundamental revision. We'll contact you soon with more detailed assessment once I've completed my current investigation. The message was designed to sound like normal military communication to any external observers, while potentially conveying to a human operative that he was aware of the true situation without being ready to commit to any specific course of action. After sending the message, Vex activated the highest level of security protocols available in his quarters and began preparing for what he increasingly suspected would be his final decision as a hegemony admiral. The universe he had served faithfully for 4 decades was revealing itself to be far more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined, and the choices available to him would determine not just his own future, but the stability of galactic civilization itself. Outside his quarters, Station Zerion 7 continued its routine operations, but Vex could no longer view anything as routine. Every footstep in the corridors might belong to someone whose loyalties extended beyond their apparent species affiliation. Every routine transmission might contain encrypted instructions for operations he lacked the context to understand. Every familiar face might conceal intentions that had been carefully cultivated over decades of patient preparation. The tactical situation had evolved beyond conventional military parameters into something that resembled a cosmic-scale intelligence operation, where the primary battlefield was the collective consciousness of galactic civilization itself. And somewhere in the depths of space that officially didn't exist, ancient enemies, who had supposedly been extinct for 2 centuries, were preparing to reveal that they had spent those centuries becoming something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Vex spent the next several hours reviewing tactical manuals and strategic doctrine, searching for precedents or theoretical frameworks that might apply to his current situation. But traditional military theory assumed that enemies operated according to recognizable patterns of resource acquisition, territorial expansion, and technological development. The human approach appeared to be based on principles that turned those assumptions into strategic vulnerabilities. Instead of building larger fleets, they had infiltrated existing fleets. Instead of conquering territory, they had positioned assets to control the flow of information and resources across existing territories. Instead of developing superior weapons, they had found ways to turn their enemies' weapons against themselves. It was a form of warfare so sophisticated that most military commanders wouldn't recognize it as warfare at all. The implications extended far beyond immediate tactical concerns. If humanity had indeed achieved this level of strategic dominance through infiltration and manipulation, then the entire structure of galactic civilization was built on foundations that could be undermined at any moment. Economic systems, communication networks, military command structures, all of it potentially compromised by operatives whose true loyalties had been concealed for generations. Vex's personal chronometer indicated that 18 hours had passed since his conversation with Morrison and Krisk. In approximately 54 hours, the human colonial authority would contact the Galactic Council with a proposal that would either begin a new era of interspecies cooperation or trigger a conflict that could destabilize civilization across multiple galactic quadrants. He activated his communications array and composed a message to the one person whose loyalty he still believed he could trust, Admiral Corinth Valdris, the officer who had commanded the original invasion of the Sol system and whose reports Vex had reviewed in the vault of censored knowledge. If anyone would understand the implications of humanity's survival and strategic development, it would be the commander who had faced their military capabilities directly. But when Vex accessed the personnel directory to obtain Valdris's current contact information, he discovered something that made his tactical mind shift into emergency analysis mode. According to the official records, Admiral Corinth Valdris had died in a shuttle accident 7 years ago while traveling to a classified briefing on deep space strategic initiatives. The accident report was thorough and detailed, describing a cascade failure in the shuttle's navigation systems that had resulted in a collision with an uncharted asteroid. But as Vex read through the technical specifications, he began noticing details that didn't align with standard shuttle operating procedures. Navigation systems that had somehow failed to detect an obstacle that should have been visible on sensors from considerable distance. Emergency communication protocols that had malfunctioned at precisely the moment when a distress call might have summoned rescue operations. More disturbing was the timing of the accident. It had occurred just 3 days after Valdris had submitted a request to the Galactic Council for permission to conduct a follow-up investigation of the Sol system, citing incomplete intelligence regarding human defensive capabilities and potential security implications for ongoing strategic planning. Vex found himself staring at the accident report, his decades of tactical experience allowing him to see patterns that would have been invisible to civilian investigators. The probability curves for the sequence of system failures were so far outside normal parameters that they could only be explained by either impossible coincidence or deliberate sabotage by someone with intimate knowledge of shuttle operating procedures and emergency protocols. Admiral Corinth Valdris, the one officer in the hegemony who had direct experience fighting human forces and who understood the true scope of their military capabilities, had died under circumstances that prevented him from sharing that knowledge with anyone else. and his death had occurred just as he was attempting to investigate whether the human threat had been as thoroughly eliminated as the official records claimed. The implications cascaded through Vex's tactical mind like a strategic simulation running at maximum processing speed. If human operatives had been positioned to eliminate military personnel who posed threats to their concealment, then the scope of their infiltration extended beyond intelligence gathering into direct action operations. They weren't just collecting information. They were actively managing the information environment to ensure that inconvenient truths remained buried. Vex began reviewing the personnel files of other officers who had served during the human campaign, searching for patterns in career trajectories and mortality statistics. What he found made his combat instinct surge to maximum alert. Over 60% of the senior officers who had direct combat experience against human forces had either died in accidents, been transferred to remote postings, or taken early retirement due to medical conditions that prevented them from serving in active strategic planning roles. The pattern was subtle enough to avoid triggering automated anomaly detection systems, but clear enough to someone with tactical training to recognize as systematic elimination of potential threats to operational security. Someone had spent decades carefully removing individuals whose knowledge and experience posed risks to a larger strategic operation. His communications array chimed with another incoming message, this time from Captain Morrison. The transmission was brief, but carried undertones that suggested the conversation was entering its final phase. "Admiral, I trust your additional research has been illuminating. Perhaps we should meet again to discuss the practical implications of your discoveries." Vex stared at the message, understanding that his window for independent decision-making was closing rapidly. Events were accelerating according to a timeline that someone else had established, and his choices were becoming increasingly limited to variations on acceptance or resistance to developments he couldn't control. He began composing a response, but found himself uncertain about what tone to adopt. Defiance would likely prove futile against opponents who had demonstrated the ability to manipulate events across centuries. Cooperation would mean betraying everything he had sworn to protect, but might also represent the only viable path for preserving some semblance of stability during whatever transition was coming. In the end, he chose a middle approach, agreeing to the meeting while reserving his options for whatever revelations might follow. "Captain, yes, my research has provided valuable context for understanding our current situation. I'm prepared to discuss the practical implications and explore potential approaches to the challenges we face." After sending the message, Vex spent several hours reviewing his personal affairs and ensuring that his tactical analysis files were properly encrypted and stored in secure locations. If his upcoming conversation with Morrison resulted in his elimination or permanent disappearance, he wanted to ensure that someone might eventually discover the truth about what had happened during humanity's supposed extinction. But even as he made these preparations, Vex found himself questioning whether such precautions would prove meaningful against opponents who had demonstrated the ability to manipulate official records and eliminate potential threats with surgical precision. If human operatives could orchestrate the death of an admiral and make it appear accidental, they could certainly ensure that any evidence he left behind would never reach individuals capable of acting on it. The universe had become a place where centuries-old enemies could operate invisible fleets, and where trusted allies might serve masters whose very existence was officially denied. And in less than 48 hours, those enemies would begin revealing themselves to a galactic civilization that had no idea how completely it had been infiltrated and compromised. Captain Morrison arrived precisely on schedule, accompanied by the same escort of guards whose equipment continued to defy identification through Vex's tactical analysis systems. But this time, Morrison made no attempt to maintain his Vorthak disguise. He appeared as unmistakably human, with the kind of confident bearing that came from operating according to superior strategic intelligence. "Admiral," Morrison said as he entered Vex's quarters, "I trust your research into personnel files and accident statistics has provided useful insights into the scope of our operational capabilities." Vex felt his tactical mind noting the casual way Morrison referenced information that should have been inaccessible to anyone outside the hegemony's command structure. "Captain, your intelligence-gathering abilities are comprehensive. Admiral, when you've spent 2 centuries learning to understand your enemies better than they understand themselves, conventional intelligence gathering becomes a relatively straightforward exercise." Morrison moved to the chamber's central display, activating holographic controls with casual familiarity. "But our conversation today isn't about demonstrating capabilities you've already discovered. It's about helping you understand what comes next." The holographic display activated, showing a real-time tactical overview of the galaxy that made Vex's combat instincts surge to maximum alert. Fleet positions, communication networks, supply routes, strategic choke points, everything was mapped with a level of detail that suggested intelligence-gathering capabilities far beyond anything in official threat assessments. But what made the display truly disturbing were the tactical annotations overlaying the information. Predicted fleet movements for the next 72 hours, analysis of communication patterns that suggested knowledge of classified military operations, resource allocation projections that indicated intimate understanding of strategic planning processes across multiple major powers. "This level of intelligence penetration," Vex said slowly, "represents capabilities that should be impossible without." "Without what, Admiral?" "Without operatives embedded at the highest levels of every major governmental and military organization in the galaxy." Morrison's expression carried the kind of quiet confidence that came from operating according to overwhelming strategic advantage. "You're beginning to understand the scope of what we've achieved during our supposed extinction." The display shifted, showing communication intercepts from across hegemony space. Conversations between fleet commanders discussing operational security concerns, intelligence briefings detailing anomalous activities that couldn't be explained through conventional threat analysis, strategic planning sessions where senior officers expressed private doubts about the reliability of their own command structures. "Admiral, what you're seeing represents the collective consciousness of an organization that has begun to suspect it's been compromised, but lacks the conceptual framework to understand how completely that compromise has been achieved." Morrison gestured to the scrolling text of intercepted communications. "Your colleagues know something is wrong, but their tactical training provides no guidance for scenarios where the threat comes from within their own institutional structures." Vex studied the intercepted messages, recognizing the voices and communication patterns of officers he had served alongside for decades. Their concerns were legitimate: equipment malfunctions at strategically inconvenient moments, intelligence reports that seemed to anticipate enemy actions with impossible accuracy, supply chain disruptions that forced tactical modifications in favor of strategies that might benefit unknown third parties. "How long have you been monitoring our communications?" "Admiral, the question isn't how long we've been monitoring your communications. It's whether any of your communications have ever been truly private." Morrison manipulated the display controls, bringing up message logs that extended back decades. Every conversation, every strategic briefing, every classified intelligence report, we've been listening, learning, and occasionally guiding discussions in directions that served our larger strategic objectives. The implications were staggering. If human operatives had been accessing hegemony communications for decades, then they possessed intelligence about military capabilities, strategic intentions, and operational vulnerabilities that would make conventional military resistance virtually impossible. They would know about defensive preparations before those preparations could be implemented. They would understand tactical doctrines better than the officers who had developed them. They would be able to anticipate and counter military responses with precision that bordered on prescience. And now you're revealing yourselves because... Morrison's expression became serious, and Vex caught undertones that suggested this conversation was approaching its crucial revelation. Because the infrastructure we've spent 2 centuries building has reached the point where concealment is no longer necessary for operational security. We are strong enough now to survive discovery, and patient manipulation is no longer the most efficient path toward our ultimate objectives, which are preventing galactic civilization from following the same path that led to the bombardment of Earth. Establishing frameworks for interspecies cooperation that don't depend on the systematic elimination of cultures deemed inconvenient by dominant powers, creating stability through strength rather than through fear. The holographic display shifted one final time, showing projections for the next phase of human operations. Simultaneous contact initiatives with every major galactic power. Revelation of infiltration networks that extended across hundreds of star systems. Introduction of new technologies and strategic capabilities that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in galactic politics. Admiral, in 36 hours, the human colonial authority will begin the most complex diplomatic and military operation in galactic history. Representatives will appear simultaneously at government centers across known space, presenting evidence of our survival and proposals for new frameworks of interspecies cooperation. Vex studied the operational timeline, his tactical mind analyzing the coordination requirements for such a massive undertaking. And if those proposals are rejected, then the rejecting parties will discover that their rejection doesn't actually matter because the alternative frameworks have already been implemented through the infrastructure we've spent 2 centuries building. Morrison's voice carried undertones that reminded Vex uncomfortably of the final communications from the vanished battle groups. The choice isn't whether change will happen. It's whether existing leadership structures will participate in managing that change. You're talking about the systematic overthrow of galactic civilization. No, Admiral. We're talking about the systematic evolution of galactic civilization into something that doesn't require the periodic extermination of entire species to maintain stability. Morrison paused, studying Vex's expression with the kind of analytical intensity that suggested he was evaluating multiple contingency plans simultaneously. The current system is unsustainable. It depends on expansion through conquest, resource acquisition through exploitation, and security through the elimination of potential threats. Eventually, those approaches run out of viable targets, and the system consumes itself. The analysis was uncomfortably accurate. Vex had spent 4 decades serving a military structure that depended on continuous territorial expansion and resource acquisition to maintain its operational capabilities. The hegemony's entire economic and political system was built on the assumption that there would always be new systems to conquer and new populations to integrate into the imperial structure. But what would happen when expansion reached its practical limits, when all viable territories had been conquered and all useful resources had been extracted? The tactical mathematics were unforgiving. Eventually, the system would begin turning its expansionist tendencies inward, leading to internal conflicts that could destroy the very civilization it was supposed to protect. You're proposing an alternative to imperial expansion? We're implementing an alternative, Admiral. The proposals that will be presented to the galactic governments aren't requests for permission. They're notifications of decisions that have already been made. Morrison gestured to the tactical displays showing human assets positioned throughout known space. The infrastructure is in place. The operational capabilities are proven. The timeline for implementation is fixed. The only variable is whether existing leadership chooses to participate constructively or becomes an obstacle to be overcome. Vex felt the weight of galactic history pressing down on his consciousness. Every war he had fought, every tactical decision he had made, every strategic assumption that had guided his career. All of it was about to become irrelevant as humanity implemented changes that would reshape the fundamental structure of interspecies relations. And my role in this transition? Morrison's expression shifted to something that might have been respect. Admiral, your tactical innovations and strategic thinking have impressed our military advisors. We're offering you the opportunity to help design the frameworks that will replace the current system. Your experience with large-scale military operations would be valuable in ensuring that the transition happens with minimal disruption to civilian populations. You want me to help you conquer the galaxy? No, Admiral. We want you to help us save it from the consequences of its own unsustainable expansion patterns. Morrison paused, and when he continued, his voice carried undertones that suggested personal experience with the kind of systematic destruction that imperial policies could inflict. Earth wasn't the first world to be eliminated because it represented an inconvenient obstacle to expansion. It was simply the most recent in a pattern that has been repeating itself for centuries. Eventually, that pattern reaches species with the capability to survive elimination attempts and develop strategic responses. The silence that followed was filled with the subtle vibrations of the station's infrastructure and the distant sounds of ships moving through external docking bays. Vex found himself standing at the intersection of everything he had dedicated his life to serving and everything that humanity claimed to represent. A choice between preserving a system that had given his existence meaning and purpose, or acknowledging that the system itself might be the primary threat to galactic stability. How long do I have to decide? Morrison checked the same unrecognizable chronometer he had consulted during their previous conversation. Events are already in motion, Admiral. In 12 hours, advanced teams will begin making contact with key governmental and military leaders across the galaxy. In 24 hours, the formal presentations will begin. In 72 hours, the new frameworks will be implemented regardless of official responses. And if I refuse to participate? Morrison's expression remained carefully neutral, but Vex caught micro-expressions that suggested the human was evaluating multiple scenarios for managing potential resistance. Admiral, you're an intelligent tactician with decades of experience in strategic planning. You understand the concept of inevitable outcomes. Our operation will proceed according to its established timeline, regardless of individual decisions to participate or resist. But individual decisions will determine whether specific individuals have roles in what comes next, or whether they become obstacles that need to be managed through alternative methods. Morrison's voice carried the same undertones that Vex had heard in the recordings of Admiral Valdris's final reports. We prefer cooperation, Admiral, but our operational requirements take precedence over personal preferences. Vex studied Morrison's face, noting the subtle expressions that suggested someone who had made difficult tactical decisions based on strategic necessities rather than emotional considerations. This wasn't a threat delivered with malice. It was a professional assessment of operational realities communicated between military officers who understood that individual preferences didn't override strategic imperatives. I understand the tactical situation, Captain, but I need time to consider the implications for my personal oath and duty obligations. Of course, Admiral, but remember that those oaths and obligations were made to institutions that exist within a framework that is about to change fundamentally. The question isn't whether you can preserve your current duty structure, it's whether you want to help establish new duty structures that serve the same underlying principles more effectively. Morrison moved toward the chamber exit, but paused to deliver one final observation that made Vex's tactical mind shift into maximum analysis mode. Admiral, you've spent your career serving a system that claims to value honor, duty, and the protection of civilian populations. In 72 hours, you'll have the opportunity to see whether those values survive contact with an alternative that actually implements them systematically rather than selectively. Later, the silence that followed Morrison's departure was different from any tactical quiet Vex had experienced during his military career. This was the silence of a universe balanced on the edge of fundamental change, where every decision would cascade through consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. Vex spent the next several hours reviewing everything he had learned about human strategic capabilities and operational methodologies, searching for viable approaches to what was approaching. But conventional military doctrine provided no guidance for scenarios where enemies had achieved total intelligence penetration and positioned assets throughout the entire command structure of galactic civilization. Traditional tactical analysis assumed that conflicts involved opponents with comparable strategic frameworks and resource limitations. The human approach seemed to be based on principles that made those assumptions irrelevant. Instead of competing within existing strategic parameters, they had spent 2 centuries redefining what strategic competition meant. His communications array chimed with a final message from Admiral Horan. But as Vex began reading, he found himself analyzing every word for indications of whether his oldest military colleague was genuinely concerned about his welfare or subtly managing his decision-making process. Kelthorne, I've been thinking about our recent communications and the strategic implications of what you've discovered. Perhaps we should meet in person to discuss approaches to the challenges ahead. I have some information that might help you understand your options more clearly. The message was carefully phrased to sound like normal military communication, but Vex caught undertones that suggested multiple layers of meaning, depending on the reader's actual loyalties and knowledge base. It could be interpreted as a genuine offer of assistance from a trusted colleague, or as a subtle attempt to draw him into a controlled environment where his options could be further limited. In the end, Vex chose not to respond immediately. Instead, he activated the highest level of security protocols available in his quarters and began preparing for what he increasingly suspected would be his final decision as a hegemony admiral. The universe he had served faithfully for 4 decades was about to be revealed as something fundamentally different from what he had believed, and the choices available to him would determine not just his own future, but his role in whatever galactic civilization became after humanity finished implementing changes that had been in development for over 2 centuries. Outside his quarters, Station Zerion 7 continued its routine operations, but Vex knew that nothing would ever be routine again. Somewhere in the depths of space that officially didn't exist, ancient enemies who had supposedly been extinct for 2 centuries were preparing to demonstrate that they had spent those centuries becoming something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. In 18 hours, the galaxy would begin learning that everything it believed about human extinction was carefully crafted fiction. In 72 hours, the infrastructure for implementing new frameworks of interspecies cooperation would be activated regardless of official governmental responses, and Admiral Kelthorne Vex would discover whether 4 decades of military service had prepared him to navigate a universe where the fundamental rules of strategic engagement had been rewritten by minds that thought in terms of centuries rather than standard tactical cycle. The chronometer on his personal display showed that less than 17 hours remained before humanity began revealing itself to a galactic civilization that had no idea how completely it had been infiltrated, analyzed, and prepared for systematic transformation. And in the silence of his secured quarters, Vex made the decision that would define his role in whatever came next. He activated his communications array and composed a message to Captain Morrison. "Captain, I'm prepared to discuss the practical details of my participation in the upcoming operations. When shall we begin?" The response came within minutes. carrying undertones of satisfaction that suggested Morrison had been confident about the eventual outcome. "Admiral, excellent. Prepare for immediate transport to the operational headquarters. It's time you saw what we've been building during our extinction." The transport vessel that arrived to collect Vex was unlike anything in his tactical experience. Its hull seemed to bend light around its edges, and its energy signature was so subtle that his instruments barely registered its presence. The pilot was unmistakably human, but wore no uniform or insignia that would indicate rank or organizational affiliation. "Admiral Vex?" the pilot asked as Vex approached the vessel. "I'm Commander Elena Vasquez, your transport coordinator for this operation. Captain Morrison sends his regards and asks me to brief you on what you'll be seeing during our journey." "Commander, I appreciate the courtesy, but perhaps you could begin by explaining how your vessel manages to remain virtually undetectable to our sensor arrays." Vasquez smiled with the kind of professional pride that came from working with superior technology. "Stealth systems based on principles we've been developing since before the bombardment, Admiral. We've had 2 centuries to refine techniques for avoiding detection by galactic sensor networks." As the transport moved away from Station Zerion 7, Vex found himself studying displays that showed space around them in ways that challenged his understanding of sensor technology. Other vessels appeared and disappeared from the screens like ghosts, following flight patterns that suggested a level of coordination impossible without communication systems far more sophisticated than anything in official military inventories. "How many ships are operating in this region?" "Admiral, you're currently surrounded by approximately 40 vessels ranging from single-pilot reconnaissance craft to heavy battleships comparable in size to your largest dreadnoughts. They've been monitoring activities in this sector for the past 6 months, ensuring operational security during the final phases of preparation." 40 vessels. Vex's tactical mind ran calculations on the coordination requirements for operating that many craft in close proximity without detection by the hegemony's extensive sensor networks. The technological capabilities and organizational discipline required were beyond anything in his experience with conventional military operations. The transport continued through space that appeared empty on standard sensor readings, but which Vex now understood was filled with human vessels operating according to stealth protocols that made them effectively invisible to galactic detection systems. The scope of the infrastructure was staggering, not just individual ships, but entire fleets positioned throughout known space without anyone suspecting their presence. "Commander, how long have human forces been operating at this level of deployment?" Vasquez consulted a display that showed tactical information extending across multiple galactic quadrants. "Active stealth operations have been maintained for approximately 50 years, Admiral. Before that, we spent a century and a half developing the technological capabilities and organizational structures necessary for this level of deployment. And the ultimate objective? Complete strategic dominance, achieved through methods that make conventional military resistance irrelevant." Vasquez's voice carried undertones that suggested personal experience with the kind of systematic planning required for such long-term operations. "We learned from Earth's bombardment that survival isn't about building better defenses. It's about ensuring that your enemy's offensive capabilities become strategically meaningless." The transport began decelerating, and Vex found himself staring at a structure that challenged his understanding of engineering and construction capabilities. The facility was massive, easily the size of a major space station, but its design incorporated principles that seemed to bend physical laws around their architectural requirements. "Welcome to Deep Heaven Station, Admiral," Vasquez said, as docking procedures engaged automatically. "Primary operational headquarters for the Human Colonial Authority and home base for approximately 200,000 personnel representing 47 different species." 47 species. Vex felt his tactical mind struggling to process the implications of a human facility that housed representatives from nearly every major civilization in the galaxy. The coordination challenges alone would be staggering, but the security requirements for maintaining such an operation without detection were beyond anything in conventional military planning. As they docked and moved through airlock procedures, Vex found himself in corridors filled with beings whose uniforms and equipment indicated military and civilian specializations from across known space. Hegemony officers working alongside personnel from the Krellion Confederacy, the Zephyr Collective, and species he didn't immediately recognize. "The personnel here," Vex asked as they moved toward what appeared to be a command center, "are they all volunteers who chose to participate in our operations rather than continue serving systems that they came to understand were unsustainable, Admiral? Some have been with us for decades. Others joined more recently as our recruitment capabilities expanded." The command center that Vasquez led him to was a symphony of coordinated activity that made Vex's decades of military experience seem like preparation for this moment. Holographic displays showed real-time tactical information from across the galaxy. Fleet positions, communication intercepts, resource flows, political developments, all integrated into a comprehensive overview that represented intelligence-gathering capabilities beyond his most ambitious theoretical projections. Captain Morrison was waiting at the center of the activity, surrounded by personnel whose species diversity reflected the scope of human recruitment operations. "Admiral Vex, welcome to the operational heart of the most complex military undertaking in galactic history. I trust the journey provided useful perspective on our infrastructure capabilities?" Vex studied the displays around him, noting tactical information that should have been impossible for any external organization to acquire. "Captain, this represents intelligence penetration so complete that conventional military security becomes meaningless." "Exactly, Admiral. When you understand your opponent's capabilities better than they understand them themselves, conventional military competition becomes a matter of choosing when and how to reveal your advantages." Morrison gestured to displays showing countdown timers for various operational phases. "In 14 hours, advanced teams will begin making contact with key governmental leaders across the galaxy. Are you prepared to see what 2 centuries of patient preparation can accomplish?" The universe was about to discover that humanity's extinction had been the greatest strategic deception in galactic history.